morning. It's almost good afternoon, but we'll still call it morning. So thank you all for coming. Thank you for having me. I'm Stephanie Shipton. I'm from the National Governors Association. NGA is the membership organization for all of the nation's governors, which means we have 55, including the territories. And we, along with the Council of Chief States Law Officers, co-lead the Common Core State Standards Initiative, including the development process, the writing, and now supporting states through implementation. So if I can just get a quick show of hands, how many people have heard of the Common Core? Okay. How many people think they have a good idea of what it is? They could probably talk about it and be okay with that. Maybe just a quick show of hands. Okay, perfect. So I want to let you know I do have a PowerPoint presentation. Unfortunately, it's on a flash drive over at the Department of Education, but I'm happy to make the slides available. So for now, please bear with me. It's a lot of information, and I will try to talk a little bit slower than I usually do. But I'm happy to make those available. So the Common Core State Standards Initiative, and if you have any questions at any time, please feel free to interrupt, is a state-led initiative to develop academic standards. So not standards for curriculum, not standards for instruction, academic standards, essentially expectations for students in grades K through 12 in English language arts and math. Now, I do want to note that the English language arts standards have a component that addresses literacy and other content areas. So how many of you have been teachers in, say, science or social studies or any other content area outside of English, or had experience with educators in this field? So you know that there are language and literacy specific implications for each of those content areas. So how you write a lab report in chemistry, how you write a research paper, and think about using primary sources or secondary sources for a history class, as opposed to the type of writing that you would do in an English language arts class. Now, they aren't mutually exclusive, they are related, but the idea is that content area teachers should also be thinking about the types of language and literacy skills specific to their content areas that students should be mastering. So why do we do this? For several years now, that all states have had academic standards. They've all set their own standards, they developed their own assessments and set their own cut scores, and what resulted were varying degrees and levels of expectations in terms of what content students need to know and be able to do, how much of that was balanced with knowledge of certain skills, and even grade placement, so when and where students learn different things and how. So for example, a student in Massachusetts, or a student in Mississippi, or any other state, who is a high flyer or valedictorian, and then their parents move. And suddenly they're in a school system where they may be relearning the same things that they learned already. And suddenly they're no longer high flyer. They're at the bottom of the barrel because now they have different expectations and different assessments. So this idea that preparing students for success in life after high school should look somewhat similar from state to state. That the expectation for college and career readiness doesn't change. The math you need to know doesn't change if you live in Hawaii or if you live in Alabama. How to read, how to write well, how to think analytically, that doesn't change if you live in California or if you live in New Hampshire. We also heard a lot from governors and chief states law officers because our organizations do not act without the blessing of our members, that there was a strong concern about the types of jobs that were available in their states and the lack of a highly skilled workforce to fill those jobs, because quite frankly their education systems were not graduating or producing the students that had the types of knowledge and skills that they needed in order to go into those workforce training programs or to go into higher education without needing any type of remediation. So that was another concern. And then the third factor really drives some of this work is some of the research from international assessments that show how much we're lagging behind other countries. My favorite thing that I like to quote from one of the writers, one of them, is if you look at international assessments, how math standards in our states have typically been structured as opposed to how standards in other states are structured, we cover more math than any other state in terms of, or any other country in terms of what's in PISA. More math. Because we don't focus on these solid foundations in math, our kids do not perform as well when they see or given a project or a problem that isn't familiar to them or isn't written in the exact same format as the test that problems on the test they had on their worksheet or on their assessment. The one thing that our kids always succeed at, though, is patterns, because we do patterns all the time in math. So as you can imagine, that doesn't bode well. So that was one of the other factors driving this work. So the standards, as I mentioned, are aligned with the expectations for college and work. And for those of you out there who say, not all kids are going to go to college, that's true. But in today's economy, the types of content knowledge and skills, so not just what you know, but how you're applying it and the types of skills you have, are actually the same. If you're going to a university, if you're going to a community college, or if you're going into the workforce in the type of job that can support a family, provide a livable wage above the poverty line, and have some opportunities for advancement. They're actually one and the same. So research has demonstrated that. These standards are very focused and coherent. So I'm not sure how many of you have been involved in standards writing before. In many states, and I'm not saying this is what happened in Hawaii, but in many states, what would happen is a bunch of people would get in a room and they'd say, well, I really like teaching this book. Let's put this in the standards of this grade. And then another teacher would say, but no, I really like doing this project. Let's put something about this in the standards for this grade too. And there was oftentimes not a lot of thought about, okay, well, what does the research say to support college and career readiness? Can you show me why this has to be in here? What resulted was oftentimes standards documents that were this big and that came in shrink wrap, and then they were really, really good bookends on teachers' shelves. They were really, really good door stops for the door to go out to recess or to go to lunch. And they weren't used because there were so many of them. Textbooks weren't aligned to them, so that didn't matter. And then the assessments weren't often aligned to them, so that didn't matter either. These standards, and I unfortunately didn't bring a hard copy with me today, the math and the ELA standards, including those for literacy and content areas, if you put them together, are about this thick. Normal font, you can read it without a microscope, they're about this thick. Compare that to the bookends, the door stops, they're much more usable. They're designed to be much more focused, much more coherent across grades. So the idea that what you learn in math in 4th grade informs what you learn in 5th grade, which then leads to what you learn in 6th grade. And those types of learning progressions are very important. They build upon the strengths and lessons of current state standards, and I'm sure I'll say this a couple of times today, that with Common Core, as you think about the development of Common Core, and also implementation, that it's important to honor the work, the good work that's already been done, and to not put the baby out with the bathwater. So for example, we built upon some of the lessons and some of the strengths from other state standards. So we looked at what Massachusetts has done. We looked at what Minnesota has done in math. We looked at California, and we tried to really learn from what they had already created. And the same holds true as you think about implementation. So what good work is already out there? What fantastic resources have your teachers already come up with that can help in the transition, that can help as you roll out Common Core? The standards are very, very tied to evidence and research, and this is very, very important. We tasked the standards writers, because I didn't write them. We hired people much smarter than I am to write them, with a set of criteria. And we said, if you write these standards, these are the need to have, not the nice to have. And these are the floor, so what all students should know and be able to do to be college and career ready. And by the way, you have to provide us evidence and research for everything. So it was not an easy task. If you look at Appendix A in the ELA standards, you'll see a lot of the research behind text complexity outlined. But that was one of the charges that we gave to the writers, that in order to defend these, they really have to be grounded in research and evidence. They're aligned with what other countries have done, other leading countries have done with their standards. We didn't take a standard from Singapore and drop it into our standards. We looked at what they had done to help inform some of the work that we did. And they also should be read to allow for the widest possible range of students to participate. And I know that's a big sentence, and it gives a lot of heartburn, and I'll come back to that. So try to hang in there until then. And again, they align with college and career readiness expectations. Now let me tell you what they do not define, because this is important for your role now as you think about implementation. The standards do not define or describe how teachers should teach. So these are not classroom instruction standards. They do not say, you're going to teach fractions, and this is how, and this is the book you're going to use, and this is the online resource you'll use. They leave curriculum and classroom instruction alone. These are the academic expectations for students for each grade or grade span, and it's up to states, districts, schools, and teachers to figure out how to bring those to life in the classroom. And they don't cover everything that should be taught. So you'll notice that these are just English, language arts, and math. Obviously you'll need to take into consideration the other content areas, but they really should be thought of as the floor. This is the bare minimum of what we should be expecting our students to be able to know and be able to do. They should not be the ceiling. And there are obviously situations where students may want to go into a STEM-focused field or a very science-focused field in higher education, and they'll need additional math courses, for example. So that touches on that they don't cover the nature of advanced work beyond the Common Core, because they really are designed to be the need to have. They also do not define the types of interventions that states may want to think about in state policy, that school districts may want to think about. I know that you are a single LEA SEA, so that narrows down your decision-making tree a little bit. But they don't go into the grand size of dictating to teachers how they should be helping their kids meet these goals. That's something that is very context-specific and would not be appropriate for us to put in the standards documents. They also do not describe how you can support ELLs and students with disabilities in meeting the standards. Again, that's a very state-specific, context-specific topic that we didn't feel was appropriate to put in this shared document. However, there are a lot of groups that are working on resources to help with those issues, and I'd be happy to share those with you. So the standards for English language arts and literacy and history, social studies, science, and technical subjects. So the standards are set up in 4 strands with 3 appendices. There are habits of mind standards. I think if you look at your GLOs, you'll see that those align pretty nicely. The habits of mind are things like the student can demonstrate independence, the student builds upon content knowledge, the student comprehends and critiques and values evidence and uses technology. And those are very similar and have the same purpose as your GLO. So it's the type, as students develop mastery in English language arts to the Common Core, these are the types of things they'll be exhibiting. The standards are divided into reading, writing, speaking and listening, and language. The appendices cover research and evidence, text exemplars, and sample performance tasks. And this is not a book list, it's just some ways to help illustrate what's in the standard, as well as annotated student writing samples. Now I'll give you the 3 big shifts in the ELA standards, the things you need to think about as you focus on implementation. So the 3 big shifts. There's a much more laser and honed focus on text complexity and the importance of increasing the students' exposure to increasingly complex text as they move forward in their academic career. So a lot of the research that we found actually demonstrated that the level of complexity in text that students are exposed to has dramatically declined in the past several decades. So for example, 30 years ago or 40 years ago, the text complexity that a high schooler was reading at is actually much higher than what it is now, which is sort of counterintuitive as you think about the more technical models and the way that the workforce is going, the demands, the language demands. Focus on argument based on evidence from a text, and then writing is fast an argument in a written document. The idea behind this is that while it is important to engage students in ways that connect them with their lives and their work, when you go to work, how many times are you asked to write a memo on how you feel about your summer vacation, or how you liked your sick day, or how you enjoyed your weekend? And if any of you raise your hands, I would be happy to apply for your position. But that students really need to be able to write an argument and form a well-thought-out argument based on evidence. And then the 3rd big shift is around informational text. So for a long time, there's been majority literature, majority fiction taught in English language arts classrooms. Are covered in English language arts standards, and that's not to say that that's not important. Those aren't important documents. They are, and we keep them in the standards, but now we also balance them with exposure to informational text. So again, this gets at the idea, how many times does your boss call you in and say, I really need a memo on evidence about love from this romance novel with Fabio and Frank? If you have that job, I don't want that job. But you're oftentimes asked to read very detailed, complex informational texts or technical manuals that students, quite frankly, just aren't exposed to. And then also, if you look at the level of text complexity in the texts that students are required to read in colleges and universities, there's a significant gap between what they've been exposed to and then what they're expected to be able to handle as soon as they get to college. So math, I'll switch gears to math standards. They also have a similar set of mathematical practices or habits in mind. So making sense of problems and persevering problem solving, modeling, using appropriate tools, attending to precision. Again, all very similar when you look at your GLOs to the language that's in here. So the way that the math standards are designed, they're K through 8, and then there are high school standards that are broken out by theme as opposed to grade, and that is because some states have taken different pathways in how they've designed math courses for high school. So for example, some states do Algebra 1, Geometry, Algebra 2. Other states do a more integrated model of Math 1, Math 2, Math 3 that blends all of those streams. But now the Common Core, here are the 3 big shifts in the Common Core for math standards. They are very, very focused and intentional on building strong foundational skills in number and problem solving. And they're okay letting some of that repeated instruction go throughout the grades as students master it to build upon the work of the previous grade. So Bill Schmidt, who's a researcher in Michigan, has actually done a study of international standards and compared them to the Common Core and the state standards. And what you see frequently in math standards across states is you've got algebra or number function, geometry, all of the 4 tracks, and you do them all every single year. And then when you look at what other countries are doing, they start by building a strong foundation so that students understand the underlying concepts and principles of math and can therefore, for example, answer assessment questions that aren't familiar because they understand the principles behind math. They're fluent in math. And then they build a staircase of learning progressions based on that strong foundation, which is very similar to what the Common Core does. What you learn in 4th grade informs what you learn in 5th grade, which is tied to what you learn in 6th grade, which is the second shift, this coherence across grade levels. And then the third shift is that they're rigorous. They're very tightly aligned to college and work expectations. So there is the option, for example, of Algebra 1 before high school, should states decide to pursue that path. So where we are now, 45 states have adopted, plus DC, plus 2 territories, and Minnesota has adopted the ELA standards. And before I dive into implementation, are there any burning questions? It was a lot of information, very fast. Yeah? For math, it's rigor, focus on rigor. And then quickly diving into implementation. So what does this mean for you? You have these standards, what are you going to do now? There are 5 buckets that we look at: assessments and accountability, and I will leave most of that to Joe. Human capital and educator capacity, higher education, curricular and instructional materials, and resource reallocation. So just quickly on assessments and accountability, things that are coming up are things like determining what your proficiency cut score will be with Smarter Balance, determining how you'll transition from your current assessment to the Smarter Balance assessment, and determining and identifying the students that are at risk now, the students that are doing okay now, but will probably be at risk when you put in the Common Core, and all of the other student populations to figure out how to best support them in ramping up to this new assessment, recognizing that they haven't had Common Core for all of their academic career, and that it will be a heavy lift for most. You have the GLOs, which are already very tightly aligned with what's in the mathematical practices. The competency-based credit option in high school, so there'll be some additional work that you'll need to do to think about that in the sense that you have these standards of now how are you defining competencies in order to award credit. Standards-based report cards that you all have put out are fantastic. I was sent an example of somebody's son's report card. They thankfully blacked his name out because I promptly sent them to 5 or 6 other states as an example of something to take a look at. You've decided to put in into place end-of-course exams. Other states are doing that as well. The Smart Balance Assessment is not the one test that will only be administered in your state, and that's all you can do, and that's it. You can have end-of-course exams and other assessments, and certainly would encourage you to continue developing a suite of formative assessment tools for educators. So implications for educator capacity. I'll stay away from teacher evaluation, but just generally, to continue to provide formative assessment tools and resources so that your educators can do on-the-spot, real-time, quick snap assessments of where their students are at, to have more data to understand how to help their students move ahead. Obviously, it's really easy to say that you should do that. Creating those are a whole set of work that, fortunately, you all will have to think about instead of me, but really, really important to not only think about developing the tools, but the training for the tools, particularly around how educators should be accessing and interpreting and using different types of data. Professional development, I can't say professional development enough, but I will say more professional development for the sake of professional development is no good. That right now, you need to be thinking about what types of professional development are most effective. We have an issue brief on that on our website that I would be happy to send out, but really thinking about what does effective, high-quality PD look like. It's job embedded, it's ongoing. How can you put that out there? What PD are you doing now that isn't effective, or are you collecting data on how effective your professional development opportunities are? Those are all things that we need to think about. Some of the levers that we always generally say to states to help drive policy in this area are, what are your requirements around licensure and certification? How can those be tweaked or adjusted so that teachers are really accessing high-quality learning opportunities as they're recertifying? And then that, in turn, helps drive changes in teacher preparation. So implications for higher education. So traditionally, and so tell me if this is the case in Hawaii, how often does higher ed and K-12, how often do they really talk? Do they go to happy hour a lot? Do they work together all the time and hang out all the time? Because it sounds like it's pretty similar to other states in the sense that there's a pretty large divide between policy leaders in higher ed, policy leaders in K-12, but also faculty in higher ed and staff in K-12. Which is true of all states, but this opportunity with the Common Core can really help bring those two groups together, especially as you're thinking about this competency-based pathway for high school, because if higher ed is the consumer of the product, which is your high school graduate, they're going to need to be able to read the transcript. And they have no clue what a competency-based credit looks like. And no clue. And there are some states that have done some work on that. I'd be happy to share those examples. And again, if we're saying that these assessments help define whether or not a student is college and career ready, what does that mean for admissions and placement at universities? Does this mean that they won't need to take a placement exam if they score high enough up? And it'll be really important to do that onboarding early on with higher education to help them understand what the Common Core is, where it came from, and to understand the value and have them engage in the conversation. And Joe can talk a little bit more about how they're engaging higher ed in the assessments. Implications for curricular and instructional materials. So Hawaii is putting together the statewide curricular framework based on what Smart Balance has done. You also have are planning to develop educational resources. We're doing some work, some technical work that should make that a little bit easier for you guys. But the adoption of high quality materials is critically important, and to do a very thorough review. So we had, for example, the Common Core came out, the final standards came out in June of 2010. And we were still tweaking them right after that, because we were really running up against the deadline. There were publishers, however, and I won't name names, that came out with textbooks that had a gold seal of approval, Common Core line on the front, May, March, and April of 2010. Now, how they did that, I have no idea, because I can personally attest that those standards changed a lot, and I don't think they have seen any of them. I'm pretty sure they hadn't. So be very careful about how you're reviewing and looking at materials, and there are resources that are on the Hawaii Department of Education website, or links to sites that have resources like publishers' criteria that the standards writers created. So for example, the types of questions you should be looking at when you're reviewing materials or creating them. And again, professional development, I can't say it enough. So you can't hand a teacher some materials and standards and say, make magic happen, and expect the world to change. You really are going to need to do some intensive targeted professional development based on the needs of the field, because teacher prep programs don't prepare teachers to do this, and often haven't because their teacher candidates have gone to teach in other states where the standards are different. Hopefully we'll see that change. So some implications for resource reallocation, and I promise I'm only a few slides away from the end, so there's light at the end of the tunnel. There are some real opportunities here for economies of scale, and for, again, looking at what's working in your system. So do you have teachers that have created really fabulous resources or taken complex texts and figured out how to write really strong text-dependent questions to those texts? Because if you give a student this fabulous, enriching lesson on the Gettysburg Address, and then your research question is, how do you feel about funerals, or how do you feel about war, you're missing the Common Core. You provide this complex text, this enriching instruction, you're missing the Common Core of the question. So how to look at some of what's already out there and repurpose it. I always like to point out the other hat, in full disclosure, that I wear at NGA is I lead our charter school board, that charter schools have the ability to be very nimble. And where there are high-quality charter schools, you'll often find the types of resources that help support implementation of the Common Core already in place. I was in New Mexico last week, and I gave the whole spiel on Common Core, and a principal raised her hand and said, well, we already do that. I put in place a school library that has 70% informational text, and I looked at lexile, and everything matches up. So try to see what's out there already, particularly during this time of transition. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, and try to honor some of the good work that's already been done. A big challenge here will be data on return on investment. So for example, looking at how many literacy reforms you have in place, do they align with the intent of the Common Core, with your goal for implementing the Common Core? And if they don't, are they effective? And if they're not, why are you still doing them? Now is the time to really focus and to align everything and think about what makes sense, and to feel okay to let go of things that are not helping students. So for implementation, we're doing a variety of work. We're doing presentations like this, helping to produce reports. I'll have an issue brief out in the next couple of months on policy implications for students with disabilities and English language learners. So that's something else that'll come out. Continuing to collaborate with lots of organizations like Smarter Balanced, and also working on a future governance structure for the Common Core State Standards Initiative. We've developed a whole host of tools and resources. We still have coursestandards.org, which is the official site. And I'd be happy, again, so you can't see it here, but the slide has lots of links, most of which are already on the department site, but there are a lot of links on the department site. And this is just a little bit of a briefer snapshot. And this one also has my email address, so please feel free to email me, sshipton@nga.org. I love answering questions about Common Core. So please feel free to call and ask me any questions. And if you have any, I'd be happy to answer them now. It wasn't that good. Okay, well, I will get over to Joe.
Charles, is it bring the computer